All right, I am here with Dan Sullivan, Executive Vice President of TBM Consulting, to talk about the impact on the rising levels of inflation and rising interest rates on the production environment. Um, Dan, to start, I'd like to just talk about with inflation at an all-time high, interest rates rising, what do you expect the impact on demand is going to be for manufacturing companies, and what are you seeing so far?
Okay. Well, of course, that's going to be sector specific, but generally speaking, we're beginning to see some softness in things that look like supply chains into the housing market and some other industrial sectors. But I think the demand is certainly going to shrink below pre-pandemic levels. I think that what we're going to see very, very soon is consumers will run out of money and patience, and they will stop buying as much as they previously are. So to know how much, I would say 5 to 25% is likely to happen sooner rather than later. I hope I'm wrong. But one other thing I'd like to point out is what's going to likely happen in these inflationary high interest rate scenarios is not only is unit volume and overall aggregate demand, I think, going to shrink. I think the mix of that demand for many of our manufacturers could in fact shift. And what I mean by that, you and I would make choices in our home budgets to, instead of going out to a fine dining operation, we may go to a casual dining operation. We may, in fact, go to a grocery store and take out instead of going to a restaurant. We will make choices. And when consumers buy from a manufacturer that makes refrigerators, I made that up, they won't buy the one that's 10 grand. They'll buy the one that's 7,500 if they have to have a refrigerator. So the demand shift from higher to mid to lower could possibly also be a fairly dramatic impact on operations, supply chains, and other decision making that senior executives are going to have to make in the short, mid, and long term.
Do you see, I guess out of curiosity, do you see demand shocks like things happening rather quickly, or is it going to be more of a just slowdown in demand like maybe we saw in the past, not
Yeah,
necessarily 2 years ago?
I'm hopeful it'll be slower rather than abrupt. But having said that, I'm getting some sensitivity from some of the clients that I work with that they're beginning to make more prudent decisions and much more cautious around the demand that they receive. And one of the solutions that I think we need to do in the near term is to be very, very prudent and dig very deeply into order patterns and make sure that what you're responding to from a fulfillment capability is in fact true demand and not aspirational demand. And what I mean by that is many sales and planning organizations respond to sales teams' hopes and aspirations as opposed to true customer demand. It's difficult to find in many settings, but now's the time to challenge your planning and front end pieces of your business to find true demand or as close to that as they can so that the fulfillment or the back wheel of a machine can best be prepared to respond to that. The last thing in the world you want to do is chase demand that really isn't there in the scenarios that I think are already coming. So hopefully slower rather than fast, but who knows?
And like you said, sector specific. So
Sure, certainly.
okay, so let's talk about, you talked about time horizons. So in the short
Sure.
term, what should COOs and manufacturing leaders be doing in the next 6 months to prepare for a demand shift? What should they be doing right now?
Well, I think right now I'd be caution would be the key, prudence would be the key, and if it were me, and for instance I was a COO of a supply chain or a vice president of supply chain, I would make decisions that sound a lot like be very cautious in staffing or human capital ads. I'd make sure that the staffing ads that I make are the right ones and only critical and key ones, and make sure that your organization justifies those. Uh, Capital outlays, I would replace equipment that absolutely needed to be replaced for quality and safety and other reasons. But I would be very cautious about expansion of equipment to chase higher and higher demand levels, higher and higher service levels. Because again, I think the demand side is going to slow down and I think the supply side is going to catch up. And then, of course, we're left with now what do we do? So I'd be very prudent and cautious about some of those decisions, particularly in the near term, because They read the news, you read the news, we all read the news. There's no good news. And sometimes the prediction of bad news creates bad news. So I'd be very, very, very cautious. And the other thing I would do, I would look internally and I would challenge my teams, my sales teams, my planning teams, my operations teams, my engineering and support teams, to find ways to make what they do better today than yesterday. In other words, let's really get rooted in daily performance and execution excellence right now and focus, 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 because there's no time like right now to be better than at what we're doing. So I think many of those things, I've rambled a little bit there, but cautious, prudent, and look internally at the way you're performing today and make sure it gets better.
On that line of getting better, you talked a lot to me in setting this up about service levels and like
Sure.
service level degradation. Basically, that service levels are maybe as low as you've ever seen them. Maybe I'm being extreme, but
About as bad as I've seen them in many cases, right? Consistently bad, yeah.
yeah. And consistently bad is what? Let's talk about that.
Well,
What is it looking like now? What should it be looking like?
I'll tell you, the worst I've ever heard is what's your service level, and they say we stopped measuring it because it's so bad or so poor. But on average, I would say many people will feel good about today 80 and 85% service levels. They'll feel pretty good about that, and they will say things like, in spite of all of the supply chain issues, the labor shortages, the other circumstances that we face, the spiky demand, et cetera, we are still able to fulfill on 80 to 85% of their promises. That's a really poor place to be. That's not going to be satisfactory in a world that's more normal supply and demand. It's not going to be satisfactory when competitiveness really begins to matter, and you and I as consumers have to make a real hard choice. We can choose to walk from a choice, or we can choose to make a choice. And I like to say to my clients, let's compel the next buyer of our product and service to choose us. And let's compel them to choose us. And I think the best way to do that is on our promise keeping, or our ability to serve when it is they say they want it, we say we'll get it there. So service levels have to improve. They have to start focusing on much more competitive, more normal performance, because people will choose other avenues. Someone will be the one to provide, is what I like to say.
I love that you also said the other day to me, you said, Jason, service levels are 80% and the lead times are terrible. So, let's talk about that. Talk to us
Yeah.
about lead times.
Well, lead times are chronically poor in spiky demand and erratic demand scenarios anyway. But I think in the last 2 years, what has happened is that abnormality, that dramatic change in circumstance has become what many people call the new normal. And when it becomes new normal, the businesses have become punch drunk. They're almost like, oh, well, it's the way it is, and there's nothing we can really do about it. And they become lethargic. And then I've seen lead times in some circumstances shift from 4, 6, and 8 weeks, 12, 15, and 24. And then it becomes far easier to go from 24 to 36. And somewhere in the 36 to 48 week. I mean, my conversation with executives is, I would forget what I bought when I got it if lead times were that bad. I mean, it's really, Jason, it's really, really bad. Now, it's a great time to get better and to start winning, because it's very easy to distinguish a lead time performance of 12 weeks from 36.
Yeah.
Now you can start winning if you're 12 and they're 36.
So I want to shift gears on a couple fronts.
Sure.
I want to talk to you about the longer term. So
Sure.
12, 18 months out, what should I be doing, in that window,
Yeah.
based on where we are right now?
Now here's where I would begin using some of the mechanisms that we've begun to talk to our clients about, like some what if scenarios and some stressing our organization. I call them war games, if you will. I would really start finding what I believe to be the consensus view of what's going to happen in our business and in our competitive landscape. And I would challenge my teams to find that, even though they say it's impossible. Nothing's impossible. Close examination and analysis will always give you better answers. But I would challenge the human capital dynamic of my business and find what's right for what I think is going to happen 18, 24, and 36 months out. Therefore, it leads us to things like, what does expansion look like or not? What does my capital investment scenario and decision making look like or not? What are the ramifications for my supply chain and the choices I make there? So there's a lot of real good work to do in the next 12 and 18 months, because I think hopefully in 12 to 18 months, perhaps the bottom will have come, if there is such a thing. Recovery will soon come, if there is such a thing. But out of that shambles, there's going to become a shining star, and it's the guy that's ready to kind of return to something that looks like more normal, more competitive environments where quality, speed, and service really matter. Cost is always important, but it becomes much more important when people can't afford what it is you buy anyway, and they say to you, price pressure is coming, and you look at yourself and you say, what do I give up? Do I give up margin, or do I challenge my own cost structure to be more appropriate and to be more profitable and more of a winning strategy? So I think there's a lot that's got to happen in the next 12 to 18 months that means choices with good analysis, consensus view, and a lot of what is, with, of course, ramifications known up or down with every choice you make. Because again, flexibility is the way you win in any dynamic environment. If everything were stable and everything were the same, it'd be easy to compete because all we do is turn on the switches at the factory. It doesn't work that way.
So I want to ask you one question about, you talked a lot about stress testing your
Sure.
organization. What does that look like? When TBM does a stress test, what outcomes does someone
Yeah,
expect from
our
that?
clients and those that know a little bit about us know that we're really good at what we call operations diagnostics, due diligence. We're really good at imaging a current state, understanding a current dynamic in a factory, operation, supply chain, warehouse, distribution system, new product development scenarios, et cetera. We know what they're doing today. We're also really, really good at challenging what it could be given certain scenarios. So it would look similar in some ways to what we do in diagnostic, but I don't choose to use diagnostic because we're throwing a host of what I call scenarios at the current circumstance. We're going to stress current capacity. We're going to stress current human capital, size, and capability. We're going to stress the supply chain for lead time challenges. We can drop in scenarios that say, what if our customers absolutely demand 12 weeks? What has to change? If the demand were to shrink 10% and the mix more dramatically than that, what has to change? So we're going to look at those things. And again, I call it war games. And we have to be prepared for these things. Now, the stress test in and of itself will not tell you the answer, but it'll give you something for an executive team to ponder and a basis upon which we can make better decisions. You can't wait till you're in the war. You got to play the war games and understand what you're going to do.
Yeah.
And I think it's time to do that, because I think that on the people side, on the hard asset, capital asset, equipment and machinery side, on the supply chain side, on the new product and development side, there's a host of options that we can take that in 18, 24, and 36 months, we can change the outcome. We can create an outcome that fits the scenarios that we believe we're more likely to face. And when we do that, and if we do that, we'll be the winner, someone else won't be. And again, everyone I work with, I try to challenge them. We got to win. We're not in this playing around. We're going to win. The other guy's not.
All right, one last question for you before we wrap. And it's, when you look at this operating environment and you compare it to past periods in history where we've had high inflationary environments, the 70s, early 80s, what do you think is going to be similar and what's going to be different? And what can we learn from the past and what's all new?
Yeah, I don't think, well, what will be a little different is I don't think the bad will be as bad. I'm hopeful. I don't think interest rates are going to be as bad as what when I came into the workspace, into the industry space as an engineer, I know that we were facing interest rates that were just unbelievably high. I'm hopeful that doesn't happen. But there will be decisions made on cost of capital. There will be decisions made upon choices around capital equipment, new, replace, et cetera. And that's going to be similar. I think the thing that's going to be different is I believe the customer base and the marketplace will be more demanding today than it was yesterday. You and I, we expect a lot more around speed, service, ability to get what we want when we want it. I mean, Amazon changed that. Streaming services changed that. Instant gratification is a norm. It's not a special nuance. So I think that your marketplace, your customer base is going to expect recovery fast rather than slow. And they're going to expect winning versus losing faster rather than slower. And they're not going to be tolerant. So I believe that's going to be more demanding than it was even yesterday. No one likes inflation. No one likes cost pressures. No one likes, stressing around cost of capital. But someone's going to buy something in whatever industry or whatever competitive landscape you're in. There's always a next guy that can get the order if you don't get it. And there's usually a next and a next and a next. Leadership needs to think about what are the choices going to be made and can I beat the other guy and on what basis? So that's why I like the image. Again, I call it a stress test. Wouldn't you rather stress on paper and an analysis and come up with scenarios or ranges of outcomes rather than wait till you're in it, make a choice and realize it was the wrong one, which is what's been happening for the last 2 or 3 years? I mean, if you're going to move chips on the table, I'd like to know kind of what the probabilities are of those outcomes a lot more clearly.
Sound management.
Yeah,
can't
I think so. Good.
All right. Thanks, Dan. This was great.
Well, I appreciate it.